Thank you very much, Professor Thomas. It's an honor to be here at Mercer University as a guest of the McDonald Center for America's Founding Principles. I'm grateful to have been invited by Professor Thomas to talk here. And to all of you out here, especially the students, I am honored and grateful that you've come and given up your evening to hear what I have to say. It's my job to talk to you, and it's your job to listen. I understand that you will finish your job in 50 minutes. I will try to finish my job before then. I'm going to show a number of slides on the screen. They're going to zip past. They're numbered, and there's 77 of them, so you can keep track and have hope. So, the McDonald Center's website has on its landing page a rotating marquee of these three images, each with quotations. One is from Thomas Jefferson, one of the American founders. One is from the philosopher, scientist, and political theorist Aristotle, who lived in Athens and worked in Athens in the 4th century BC. That's the 300s BC. The third one is attributed to Socrates, who was a philosopher who lived under, fought in combat on behalf of, and was ultimately executed by the democratic government of Athens in the 5th century BCE. So, 5th century BC, 4th century BC, Athens, American founders. I'm going to try to bring these together in a way that I hope is coherent and perhaps thought-provoking. And I'm going to throw in a little bit about what I've learned from teaching Greek to undergraduate students at Furman University, where I work. So, the American founders didn't really think much about Athenian democracy, or didn't think much of Athenian democracy. We can see this in our language. While the language of science and mathematics is full of Greek words, hypotenuse, Euclid people, synthesis, even things that were discovered in the 1700s, like oxygen, and a religious vocabulary, right? Ecclesiastical, synagogue, doxology. But our American political vocabulary is lacking in Greek. In the United States, we have a president. We don't have a prostates. We have a Senate. We don't have a boule. We have a Congress. We don't have an ecclesia. We have a constitution. We don't have a politeia. And we live in a republic. We don't live in a politeia. Now, we do use Greek words when we talk about politics. Here are some of them: monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, tyranny, democracy. So all of these, except maybe the last one, at least to Americans, are bad words, right? And I'm interested in that. But I want to come back to that word politeia, which you might have noticed there's some kind of fuzziness about that. Like, what does that word mean? Politeia. It means constitution with a lowercase c. It's often translated into Latin as res publica, and so the book you probably know as Plato's Republic in Greek is called the Politeia. But I'm particularly interested in what Aristotle means when he says Politeia. Now, Aristotle was smart. He was interested in the natural world, the supernatural world, mathematics and logic, literature and politics. He was not an Athenian, but he lived and worked in Athens. He wrote about Greek tragedy and seemed to have particularly liked the plays of Sophocles, and I'm going to talk about those today. Aristotle wrote a number of books on politics. One of them is called Politics. He wrote a bunch of books describing the governments of various Greek cities, and each one of these books is called a politeia. So politeia can mean any kind of government, but it can also mean a book about a kind of government, right? Now, in Aristotle's book, The Politics, he gives 6 generic types of government. 3 of them, he says, are correct or straight. Orthai is the Greek word. 3 of them are divergent, ekbases. And those are corruptions of the straight or correct ones. Here's the chart, and it might look a little surprising to you. Monarchy is a correct form of government, and tyranny is divergent from it. Okay, that works pretty well, right? Aristocracy is correct, and oligarchy is divergent. But then something called politeia is correct, and democracy is divergent from that. So now we have one more meaning of politeia. It's a description of a government, it's a government, or it's a straight kind of government. And Aristotle says a little bit more, and this is also surprising. He says politeia is, to put it simply, a mixture of oligarchy and democracy. And so this is like a weird kind of political alchemy, right? You can mix two divergent forms of government and get a straight form of government. I don't know what that means. This is what else he says. When the multitude governs according to the common advantage, then this system of government is called by the term also used to designate systems of government in general, namely, politeia. I am not a political scientist. I'm not a philosopher or a political theorist. I like reading Greek and typing on the computer. But to read Greek, I need to know what the words mean. And so I'm interested in this. And I'm particularly interested to know if by exploring what this word means, I can help understand the ancient world and maybe the modern world. So let's talk about Athenian democracy. The city of Athens has a democratic government right now. Its mayor is Yorgos Kaminis. Here he is. But I want to talk about ancient Athenian democracy. And I'm going to define that as the government of the ancient city-state of Athens between 490 BCE and 322 BCE. And these dates, we could argue about them. It doesn't really matter. The first one is the date of the Battle of Marathon, where the Athenians were newly democratic and beat the giant Persian Empire. And they decided that this victory meant that the gods loved them. The second date is the Lamian War, which you probably don't know a lot about because nobody does. This is when the Macedonian successors to Alexander the Great finally ended Athens' desire or ability to be an independent geopolitical actor. And that's enough. That's enough of that. So we're looking at 168 years of democracy in Athens. So what was democracy in Athens? So I'm going to teach you a lot of Greek words here. Democracy, quite simply, is when the kratos and the power is in the hands of the demos, the people. And of course, in ancient Athens, the people meant just the men who weren't slaves, right? But that's what they call it. In Athenian democracy, the demos, the people, met in an assembly to discuss and vote on laws and policies. There were public officials and a legislative body, the council, for efficiency. But those were drawn from the demos. Offices were not inherited, and offices were not limited to members of particular aristocratic families. So how do we know about Athenian democracy? If you want to learn about Athenian democracy, you can read ancient historians like Herodotus or Thucydides. You can read biographies like Plutarch. Professor Thomas mentioned Plutarch, whom George Washington loved. You can read the plays produced by it, the comedies of Aristophanes and the Greek tragedies. Or you can read Aristotle's Athenaion Politeia, Aristotle's book on the constitution of the Athenians. This exists in only one copy on a papyrus, which was discovered in 1879 and is now at the British Library. The first half of the Constitution of the Athenians is Aristotle describing how Athenian government evolved from the 7th century into the 4th century. And the second half describes how it worked during his time in Athens in the 4th century. It's important to remember that of these sources, for our knowledge of Athenian democracy, not everybody knew them all the time. So the American founders certainly knew their Sophocles and their Thucydides. They couldn't read the Constitution of the Athenians because it hadn't been discovered yet. It wasn't discovered till 100 years later. By the way, classicists call it the Athpal. So if you want to be cool, you can call it Athpal. Athpal. Now, it seems to me that any nation that tends towards some kind of distributed government has to invent a bad guy form of government to define itself against, right? The United States did this in the Cold War, like communism was the bad guy and we're not like them. The ancient Romans had monarchy, kingship, right? And that was the bad guy. So ask Julius Caesar, right, how that worked out for him. For the Athenians, under the democracy, it was tyranny and aristocracy were the things they were defining themselves against. So in Greek, a tyrannos, a tyrant, is a leader who's made a sole leader by the people. So a tyrant is kind of a democratic king. Aristocracy, of course, you know, it's kind of distributed kingship, right, where certain families keep power and pass it on. Power is not widely shared outside of those families. And we can see from a couple of specific examples how the Athenians tried to limit the power of aristocracy and avoid tyranny in their democracy, especially in the early years. The first has to do with aristocracy. Athens became radically democratic around 508 BCE. That's the end of the 6th century. BC dates are hard because they're backwards and the centuries are difficult. But 508 is the end of the 6th century. And they had a series of reforms, but one of them had to do with how people identified themselves officially. And before 508, everybody used their name and a patronymic, so their first name and their daddy's name. So Pericles, son of Xanthippus. After 508, on official inscriptions and things, names are first name and demotic. So you had your name and then your voting district. So Pericles, the famous Pericles, would then be Pericles from Calargus. Because names ran in families. And if your father's name was Megacles or Cleisthenes or Xanthippus, everybody knew you were a member of the aristocratic family called the Alcmeonidae. And you could cash that in and get more authority. If your last name was Miltiades or Kimon, everybody knew that you were from a different aristocratic family. So we'll see whether this worked or not. Also in a democracy, where the people make decisions, anyone who's good at persuading the people can become powerful. The Athenians knew that this was inevitable and even desirable, but only within limits, right? A persuader of the people who was too successful might be tempted to make himself a tyrant. And so for the first 50 years or so of the Athenian democracy, they used an institution called ostracism as a kind of safety valve. And here's how it worked. Once a year, all the Athenian citizens would get together, the demos would get together in an assembly and decide whether or not to hold an ostracism. If the show of hands was yes, then some months later, they would come together in another assembly and everybody would be invited to write somebody's name on a broken piece of pottery. And the Greek word for broken piece of pottery is ostrakon, and that's what gives this institution its name. The idea was to vote for anybody you thought was getting too much persuasive power. And the winner got voted off the island, right? They had to leave for 10 years. They didn't lose their citizenship or their money, but they just had to leave and they could come back. And so it was kind of a backhanded compliment, really. This is an ostrakon, and you can see, you can probably make out, even if you aren't that good at the Greek letters, that somebody has scratched Pericles Xanthippou, Pericles, son of Xanthippus, on this one. And this was found by archaeologists. So somebody wanted to ostracize Pericles, and I think it's kind of interesting that in this context they use his aristocratic patronymic, right? So, and it's worth noting that there was a real relationship in ancient Greek cities between tyranny and aristocracy. The people would make a tyrant, but they were always aristocrats, right? They weren't like heroes of the working class or something. They were always aristocrats who got the people behind them. Now, it's sort of a paradox of Athenian democracy that its early flowering of economic, political, and cultural power is known as the Golden Age of Pericles. And that's Pericles, son of Xanthippus, from Calargus. It's as though he were a king or a tyrant. He wasn't. He was an Athenian citizen like everybody else who was particularly effective at persuading the people. He managed to escape ostracism, and the strength of his personality and his rhetorical kung fu allowed him to shape Athenian policy. He persuaded the Athenians, the demos, to build the temples up on the Acropolis that continued to be, this is a good investment. You saw Yorgos Kaminis standing in front of them, right? It cost 20 euros to go up on the Acropolis now. And so this was a good move. On the other hand, after a couple of decades of vigorously wagging the dog, he brought about a war with Sparta, which began in 431 BC. And he set the strategy that Athens followed in the early years of that war. And you've seen the movie, so you know that it's a bad idea to go up against the Spartans on land, right? And Pericles knew that too, and so his strategy was to have all the Athenians come inside the city walls and sort of hide there when the Spartans invaded, and to rely on the massive, mighty Athenian navy to pursue a war of attrition. So Pericles is famous, and rightly so. But he's also evidence that the Athenian democracy's approaches to ensuring democracy and avoiding aristocrats and tyrants was less than 100% perfect. And it wasn't without cost that they put their trust in Pericles. He brought about this war and set its policies, and this led to urban crowding in the poorly plumbed city of Athens, which led in 429 to a terrible plague. And the historian Thucydides has a very vivid description of this plague, and it's awesome. Thucydides himself had it and got over it. Pericles got it and died of it. And 1, 2, 3, or 4 years, people disagree about this, after the death of Pericles, is when Sophocles, the poet, wrote and performed on the stage in Athens his play Oedipus Tyrannos. And I want to talk about that next. Let's talk about Greek tragedy. Greek tragedy is an entirely democratic genre of literature. What I mean is this. Every Greek tragedy was a product of democratic Athens. They were all written by Athenians, and they were paid for by the Athenian democracy, and they were performed in front of Athenian audiences at sacred festivals. Every performance was a competition, and after the tragedies were performed, a democratic jury awarded one poet a prize. Greek tragedies come in all different forms. Like, some of them aren't even very tragic. Like in Euripides' Helen, it's kind of funny and nobody dies. But the one way you can consider, I'm not going to tell you how to read anything, one way you can consider reading Greek tragedy is like this. The shared mythology that all the Greeks had, Trojan War stuff, Heracles, Perseus, this all arose in a context of monarchy. And what Greek tragedy does is to take those old stories, those shared myths, and retell them in a democratic context. And if you believe that, if that seems to work for you, then you can also use Greek tragedy as a way to try to see how Athenians thought about society and politics and things like that. So I want to talk about one tragedy in particular. It's the greatest hit of ancient Greek literature. And it's Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannos. And if you have a paperback translation of this, you may know it as Oedipus the King or Oedipus Rex. The name means Oedipus the Tyrant. People like me in my job call it the OT. To be cool, you say the OT and everybody knows what you mean. And it was written between 428, 425 BCE. So we're looking at right here, right, in our timeline, which I keep coming back to. All right, in case you've never read it or haven't read it recently, here's some spoilers. Here's how it goes. But I got to tell you, like every Athenian who walked into the theater the first time this was performed, and they said, oh, the play is Oedipus, they knew the story. So this isn't like the Crying Game where there's some big reveal at the end. Like everybody knew how it went. Here's a picture of a performance of it. So, short version, once upon a time, in the legendary time before the Trojan War, Oedipus was tyrant in the city of Thebes. There was a terrible plague in the city, and the citizens begged Oedipus to save them. In the course of Sophocles' play, Oedipus does his job as tyrant. That is, he conducts an investigation and saves the city. His investigation reveals, he discovers, that he is responsible for the plague. It's his fault. When all is said and done, the story comes out like this. Oedipus had grown up in another city, not really knowing his background or who he was. One day, on a deserted road, he killed a guy in self-defense. Going along, sometime later, he came to Thebes, whose king had recently gone missing, and where a monster, the Sphinx, was eating people because they couldn't answer her riddle. Oedipus answered the riddle. The people of Thebes, grateful and impressed with his acumen, made him tyrant. He married the recently widowed queen. Of course, it turns out the guy he killed was not only king of Thebes, but his daddy, and therefore the woman he married was his mommy, and this was icky. And furthermore, all of this had been prophesied by the god Apollo before Oedipus had even been born. So Oedipus is revealed to be the most accursed and polluted person ever, and the cause of the plague in Thebes. So he blinds himself and goes into exile, and the city is saved. Okay, so that's the story. Let's read some Greek. Near the climax of the play, the chorus, which is a kind of collective character, in this play it's like citizens of Thebes, they realize that things are going very badly for Oedipus and therefore for the city, and they sing a song. This is what the chorus does. They sing it, they sort of sing and dance back and forth sometimes. And the first stanza of the song is what I'm interested in. And the first line of that stanza, when I was reading it with my students, looks like this. The first three words are hubrin futue tyrannis. Tyranny begets hubris. Now, the first thing you might notice is that Greek is an inflected language, and so the word order doesn't work like it does in English. I'm not going to teach that. You'll have to go with that. Hubris. Tyranny, we've talked about. Begets, you know what that means. Hubris. Hubris, sometimes written with a U and sometimes with a Y in English. If you learned it in high school, you probably learned that it means overweening pride, which might be the only time anybody's ever said the word overweening to you. Right? It's the only time we use it. And sometimes you leave out the V, right? Overweening pride. And that's what it means in English. We use it in English, and that's definitely what it means. In Greek, it's a little more complicated. I think it means violence to another person's body or to their status. And I'll have to save the evidence for that for later. So, anyway, back to my reading. I was reading along, and this is what I was looking at. Tyranny begets hubris, and I called on a student, put her on the spot, because it's Greek class. I was like, translate the next line. And she said, hubris begets a tyrant. And I was like, gotcha. Right. So I proceeded to professor-splain to her that, no, remember, like you have to look at the endings and the syntax. And she's like, no, I'm totally reading it right. Like, I am right. Hubris is nominative and third-person singular verb futue, and tyrannon is accusative. And at this point, I was like, wait a minute. What are you looking at? And this is what she was looking at. And I'm going to put these together side by side so you can see what I was looking at on the top and what my student was looking at on the bottom. I was looking at Dawes' edition of the Greek text from 1986. She was looking at Jebb's edition from 1885. They aren't the same. And so, like, what's going on here? How did the text of Sophocles play radically? I mean, this is a fundamental different, like subject-object, right? This is different. How did it change during the 20th century? What's going on here? Well, you guys probably know that all ancient literature, Greek tragedy, the Bible, whatever, was transmitted through handwritten copies of copies of copies of copies of copies until the technological revolution of the 15th century when mechanical printing took over. And all of these copies, they often differ one from another. People make mistakes, right, as they copy it. And it's the editor's job to look at all these different manuscripts and decide, using scholarly wisdom and insight and experience or whatever, what is the best version of the text and to give us that, right? And so, let me show you what I was looking at. This is a page, you can't read that, it's too small. I'll make the important parts bigger. This is a page of a classical text. The larger upper bit is Greek poetry from Sophocles, or supposedly from Sophocles. This is what the editor thinks Sophocles actually wrote, or is presenting as what Sophocles wrote. So our line is right there, the one I'm looking at. I'll make it bigger before we're done. Then down at the bottom, there are these notes, and if different manuscripts have different readings, the editor is supposed to let you know that down there, sort of showing their work, right? And let's expand it. So up at the top, Daw has this: hubrin futue tyrannus. Tyranny begets a hubris. And then in the note, he has this, and this is a highly formalized, sort of compressed language. So I'm going to translate what Daw's note says. Translating, line 873. Hubris begets a tyrant is what all codices, all the ancient manuscripts say. This was corrected by Frederick Blades in 1904. Okay. This is not an example of we have evidence for A and evidence for B, we think A is right. This is, we have evidence for A and nothing but A, but that doesn't make sense, and so rather than figuring it out, we're just going to change it to B, because we're like awesome professors and we can do whatever we want, right? This is not right. Okay, so let's read it according to the evidence. So we're going to read through this whole speech. Let me find, I've got lost. Okay. Hubris begets a tyrant. This is what the chorus says. Hubris, if it is too full with many things fruitlessly. Things that aren't critical or on task. And when the hubris has gone as high as possible, it falls off a steep cliff to inevitable doom, where its feet don't offer any advantage. But the thing that's really good for the city, namely competition, I beg that the God never does away with that. I will never stop considering the God to be our president, our prostates. So, it's complicated ancient poetry, right? And so my students and I talked about it for a long time and tried to figure out what it means. And the next couple of slides are going to be my paraphrase of what I think the chorus means, sort of unpacking it a little. I think it goes like this. Striving for status can be good or bad. The bad kind is hubris. It leads to the creation of a tyrant. The bad kind is busy with irrelevant things, things that aren't helpful. This leads to disaster. But if we don't say hubris, but competition, this is good for the city. Now, our democracy doesn't have a president. The god, I don't know, Zeus, Athena, fate, I don't know, is the ultimate boss. But in our own affairs, we should rely on wholesome competition. So that's how I read it. Now, of course, any great literature is always about many things at once. I'm currently, in my mind, trying to read this play as if it were a poetic State of the Union address from the 420s BCE, when Athens was in the middle of a war, when they'd come through a nasty plague, and when the great Pericles, who was not quite a tyrant, was dead, and when the political when politics were changing. And I'm working with something like this in my mind, that this is a message that maybe we can get out of Sophocles' play about Oedipus. Oedipus was a capable and dedicated leader. He was also personally polluted and from a dysfunctional family. The city profited from his ability, but suffered from his pollution. So let's confirm our desire to avoid making aristocrats into tyrants. And let's not give any one person too much power. In our democracy, we don't have a president, after all. What we want is competition. But one thing you can say about Oedipus is that he stayed focused. He solved the problem at great personal sacrifice. So let's have competition in our city, but let's keep it focused on the good of the city, not irrelevancies, egos, or vanities. Now, when Sophocles wrote the OT, he didn't, and nobody knew, what the next quarter of a century was going to be like. Thucydides, the historian, wrote sometime after 404 BC, and he did know. In the 65th section of Book 2 of Thucydides' history, and in Book 2 he's still talking about the third year of the war. The war lasted 27 years. But Thucydides gives a massive spoiler that I've excerpted here. You can read it for yourself to confirm that I'm making stuff up, but it's kind of long and I wanted to pick and choose. So you've got a citation, you can go look it up. This is what Thucydides says. Pericles indeed, by his rank, ability, and known integrity, could exercise an independent control over the multitude, the demos. In short, to lead them instead of being led by them. He enjoyed so high an estimation that he could afford to anger them by contradiction. In short, what was nominally a democracy became in his hands government by the first citizen. But his successors were more equal to one another, and each one competing to be first himself, they were ready to sacrifice the whole conduct of affairs to the whims of the people. Such weakness led to many errors. And yet, after they had lost in the Sicilian expedition the greater part of their fleet and army, and were now distracted by revolution, still they held out for 3 years. They continued to resist and were last overthrown not by their enemies, but by themselves and their own internal dissensions. So, the revolution Thucydides is talking about is in 411 BCE, the so-called oligarchic coup, when the Athenian one-percenters overthrew the democracy and put themselves in charge. That lasted a year. In 404, as Thucydides says, they lost the war, and after all their efforts to avoid having a tyrant, they had 30 tyrants, which was dismaying, but they got it back. The Athenians got it back, and the next 50 years or so, 78 years or so, is kind of boring. Nobody really studies this because it's boring. Aristotle does in his Constitution of the Athenians. He describes during this period intricate interactions of different organs of the democracy, checks and balances, investigations into public officials before they assumed office, audits of public officials when they were leaving office, elaborate steps to prevent bribery and corruption, the annual review of all laws for duplication and contradiction. The history of the 4th century of Athenian democracy in the 4th century is boring because it worked pretty well. It was boring right up until the Macedonian Black Swan event when a bunch of military totalitarians from up north brought an end to it all. So, you'll be pleased to know some conclusions. Don't rewrite the sources. Read them. It is a mistake to try to edit an ancient text just because you don't understand it. It's more fun to try to read it in its own terms. Second, government is always a work in progress. And this, I'm mostly saying this as a reminder of myself as a classicist. We're bad about this. We tend to compress history. History is diachronic, one thing after another. It's not synchronic. And I think this is particularly important for Athenian democracy. It changed all the time. The American founders knew this as they began their project. So Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 82, "'Tis time only that can mature and perfect so compound a system." So I think it's also equally important to avoid judging, if we're going to judge ancient people, which I'm not sure is that valuable. They've gone to their reward. But if we're going to evaluate Athenian democracy, it's worth evaluating it diachronically, as an evolution, not at any one given point. Also, as people's understanding of things change, of themselves and their institutions changes, their vocabulary will change. And this is a challenge, especially for reading ancient stuff in an ancient language. The words change their meanings. Aristotle admits this in his Politics. As city-states increased in size, blah, 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 for this reason, what are now called politei were previously called democracies. So the words change their meaning. I think it's fun always to ask who knew what and when did they know it. So when Sophocles in the 420s had his chorus sing a song, critical, on task, really good for the city, competition, he didn't know that the next quarter of a century would see a political competition that was mostly disastrous. And at the end of that century, when Thucydides reflected on that competition and how disastrous it was, he couldn't yet see how well things would work in the next half century. It's Aristotle who ended up working for those Macedonians, who brought an end to Athenian democracy. He looks back in Athens and identifies a form of government when the multitude governs according to the common advantage. And I think he's trying to find a word that's not democracy, because that was a bad word. And he calls it politei. And finally, in the business of navigating the challenges of democratic or republican or any kind of shared government, it seems clear to me that many paths can often lead to the same conclusions. Because I got thinking about all of this, both from my work with my students and my embarrassment at not having noticed the problem with the text, but also looking at James Madison in Federalist 51, who says, "The great security consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the other. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition." And when I read that, I can see Aristotle and Madison kind of agreeing with each other. And maybe Sophocles and Thucydides too. Thank you.